In the respectable and generally well-behaved town of Flaxborough, the annual St. Swithin's Parish Choir Luncheon was considered one of the safest events on the calendar. Indeed, few gatherings could boast such an absence of scandal. Elderly ladies contributed sponge cakes in varying degrees of dryness. The vicar recited grace in much the same tone he used for burial services. And the choir boys, scrubbed and starched, were expected to eat their custard politely and refrain from imitating the strangled honks of the church organ's more arthritic pipes. It was therefore considered something of a breach of etiquette, if not an outright miracle, when a body was discovered before pudding. Not, of course, a fresh body. No. Flaxborough was not the sort of town where corpses were permitted to interrupt a luncheon without considerable notice. The body in question belonged to a wooden figure of St. Hildebert, carved sometime during the reign of Elizabeth I, and usually stationed on a plinth by the south aisle of St. Swithin's. It had been admired mostly by visitors from market towns, less fortunate in their religious statuary, and regarded with indifference by everyone else. What made the matter worthy of general alarm was not the saint's unexpected relocation to the choir vestry floor, but the fact that he was lying atop a choir boy. More precisely, atop the limp, pale form of Clive Purley, aged 12, known chiefly for his ability to sing a pure C-sharp despite chronic catarrh. The first person to notice the collapse, Miss Gwendolen Carter, the assistant organist, gave a shrill, strained cry, which, several parishioners later asserted, was only a semitone off an F, though opinions differed as to whether it was natural or sharp. Within moments, the vicar and a clucking crowd of parish ladies pressed in upon the scene, their expressions arranged in a configuration of horror and gratification seldom achieved, except during major funerals and minor scandals. The wooden saint was hurriedly lifted off the boy, who remained entirely unresponsive. Miss Carter, having found the fainting sofa already occupied by Mrs. Mallow of the Flower Committee, was forced to steady herself by clutching the vicar's sleeve. "It must have slipped," the vicar murmured, though without much confidence. The plinth from which St. Hildebert was not known for instability. Perhaps Clive knocked it by accident. "Oh, surely not," said Mrs. Penchlow, her eyes gleaming with the sudden prospect of gossip. "Clive is a very reliable boy. His mother always says so." This was not generally considered evidence. A whisper darted from one parishioner to another like a mischievous draught. Was he breathing? Miss Carter knelt beside the small, collapsed figure with genuine concern. But choir boys, even unconscious ones, were not noted for their stillness. Clive's oddly fixed expression left several observers exchanging delicate glances. By the time the ambulance arrived, summoned by a quivering curate, whose nerves were frequently regarded as a matter of pastoral concern, rumor had far outpaced fact. Some maintained that St. Hildebert had toppled after years of woodworm-induced weakness. Others insisted Clive had been seen earlier, poking the saint with a hymn sheet. Still others, mainly the women who staffed the parish jumble sale, recalled that Clive had always been a rather intense child, spoken in the tone usually reserved for men who ran off with au pairs. The matter might have settled into a comfortable muddle of conjecture, had not the attending medic, after a cursory examination, asked sharply, "Who moved the statue?" "Moved it?" The vicar blinked. "Well, it was on top of the boy." "I see that. But how did it come to be on top of him?" No one answered. Not because they lacked theories, but because parishioners of Flaxborough were notoriously reluctant to commit to any one explanation when several more promising and more defamatory possibilities might arise later. The medic gave a low whistle and rose to his feet. "We'll need the police." There was a silence of the most respectful kind, the sort reserved for hymn pauses and sudden moral reflection. "You don't mean," Miss Carter faltered, her hand trembling on her handbag clasp, "that it might not have been an accident?" The medic supplied. "Well, I'm not saying it was deliberate. But the angle of impact." He frowned. "It's peculiar." The vicar's complexion, already pale with clerical devotion, took on a new level of translucency. "Oh dear," he whispered. "Oh dear." As Clive was lifted onto a stretcher and borne out, limp and oddly weightless, the murmurs resumed, richer and more seasoned now that tragedy had granted permission. Terrible. Shocking. Do you suppose it's his singing? Some people can't abide a pure C-sharp. More like his pranks, muttered Mrs. Penchlow darkly. Last summer he put chalk in my bicycle pump. But all such speculation, musical, moral, or mechanical, was abruptly eclipsed by the arrival of a quietly solid figure at the vestry door, Inspector Walter Purbright of the Flaxborough Police, a man whose gentle patience had long been mistaken for simplicity by those with something to hide. He removed his hat, nodded gravely at the cluster of anxious faces, and surveyed the toppled statue, the empty plinth, and the smattering of plaster dust on the floor. "Good afternoon," he said with courteous neutrality. "I understand there's been a small problem. Incident." The vicar seized eagerly upon the word small, as though it could shrink the calamity to a mere housekeeping inconvenience. "Yes, Inspector. Pure misfortune, I'm sure. A tragic, tragic misfortune." Purbright gave a mild hum of acknowledgement, neither agreeing nor contradicting. He stepped closer to examine St. Hildebert, noting with quiet curiosity the saint's unusually serene wooden smile, as if proud to have contributed something of genuine excitement to parish life after centuries of decorative idleness. Behind him, Sergeant Sidney Love arrived, slightly out of breath and wearing the earnest expression he reserved for moments of possible importance. "Statue fell on a choir boy, sir," he whispered. "So it appears, Love." Purbright's tone remained gentle, though it might be wise not to rely too heavily on appearances. Love nodded solemnly, as if profundity were to be expected from falling statues. Purbright turned back to the vicar. "If you wouldn't mind," he said politely, "I should like to speak to those who were present at the statue." Descended. He paused, glancing at the empty plinth, and perhaps also those who were present before it descended. The vicar swallowed. "Of course, Inspector. Anything to help." "Thank you." Purbright's eyes moved over the assembled faces. Curious, anxious, a little too eager. "Perhaps," he added mildly, "one of you might tell me why St. Hildebert's right sleeve is covered in custard." A ripple of consternation passed through the room. Eyes darted, mouths twitched. Miss Carter's handbag clasp clicked once, sharply. Purbright observed it all with benign interest. Thus began the peculiar and faintly troubling matter later referred to in quiet tones as the choir boy's convenient death. Inspector Purbright, having taken in the vicar's trembling attempts at composure, proceeded with a sort of calm that soothed any room unless, of course, one happened to be guilty. In such cases, his politeness was known to elicit an unease far sharper than interrogation. The vestry of St. Swithin's was still warm with the mingled scents of furniture polish, hymn books, and timidly prepared sandwiches. Purbright let the air settle before he asked his first question. "Let us begin," he said gently. "With who last saw St. Hildebert upright?" Miss Carter stepped forward with a flutter of her fingers, as if directing a timid choir invisible. "I looked in shortly before the luncheon began, Inspector." He was quite in his usual pose. "No signs of strain or wobbling." "None at all." She swallowed. St. Hildebert stood firm, well more firmly than some members of the tenor line. This attempt at humor fluttered into the air and expired soundlessly. Purbright nodded, gently steering her to one side so others might speak. "Anyone else? Perhaps someone who happened to be in the church before the luncheon?" A brief, uncomfortable quiet settled over the group. It did not escape Purbright that the parishioners were suddenly engrossed in adjusting shawls, inspecting shoes, or examining points on the ceiling that had never previously interested them. He waited. The inspector's silences, like good wine, tended to coax out the truth in time. It was Mrs. Penchlow, never one to resist the lure of an implication, who finally surrendered. "I noticed Clive earlier, Inspector. He came in alone. Around. Oh, half an hour before the luncheon. Must have been rehearsing something." "Rehearsing?" Purbright echoed politely. "Well," she hedged. "He was humming, and I did see him standing rather close to the statue. It struck me at the time as intensely devotional, I suppose." Her meaning, though veiled by ecclesiastical phrasing, conveyed the opinion that devotional intensity in a boy of 12 was distinctly suspicious. Purbright's expression did not shift. "And did you observe him touch the statue?" "Oh, heavens, no." Mrs. Penchlow's tone implied that such a thing would have required a level of courage or irreverence entirely incompatible with membership in a minor parish committee. Yet Mrs. Penchlow felt it worthy of mention. Sergeant Love muttered at Purbright's elbow. "Couldn't be much devotion." "Let us reserve judgment, Love," Purbright murmured. "The living are often more fragile than the carved." He shifted his attention. "Reverend, did Clive often linger about the church unsupervised?" The vicar, still pale with the combined indignity and tragedy of the afternoon, clasped his hands. Clive was enthusiastic. He took his responsibilities seriously. Perhaps he hesitated a little too seriously, but he was a good boy. I cannot imagine anything he might have done to invite such a disaster. Purbright inclined his head, kindly but non-committally. He had found over years of service that few townsfolk ever imagined what anyone might do until after they had done it. Before departing the vestry, he examined the site more closely. The plinth bore no fresh splintering. The saint's base, though dusted with age, lacked any obvious fracture marks. And yet traces of custard trailed faintly down the wooden sleeve, congealing in a manner that suggested no spiritual involvement whatsoever. He touched a finger to a small patch of plaster dust on the floor. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious." The curious in question was not, as Sergeant Love assumed, the custard, but the strangely disrupted pattern in the dust. Something had been moved or dragged before the statue fell or after. Love bent beside him. "Wouldn't the saint hitting the floor make all this mess anyway, sir?" "Some of it, certainly. But dust can be as informative as footprints when one considers where it does not fall." Love blinked dutifully. "Right, sir. Let us return to the luncheon hall," Purbright said. "I should like a word with the attendees while recollections remain fresh and consciences unsettled." The hall by now bore a mournful air, half-eaten pies and abandoned plates forming a kind of culinary graveyard. A few parishioners loitered in small, uneasy knots, each eager to discuss the incident, but equally eager not to be singled out for questioning. Purbright approached a trio of elderly ladies whose conversation ceased with the abruptness of hymn books snapping closed. He smiled gently. "I gather the luncheon was proceeding quite normally until the discovery." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Hargreaves, who had a talent for speaking as though everything happened under her supervision. "Very ordinary. Except the blancmange was a little firmer this year." "And then?" "Well, Mrs." Hargreaves leaned in, lowering her voice. "Gwen, that is, Miss Carter came running in like something dreadful had happened. Which, in fairness," added Mrs. Reeton, "it had." Purbright folded his hands. "Did anyone notice Clive behaving unusually today? Anything at all, however insignificant it may seem?" "Oh, Inspector, boys are always unusual," Mrs. Hargreaves said matter-of-factly. "That is their nature," she added with delicate moral precision, though I have always thought Clive rather more. "Intense." "Intense?" "Yes. seriously. Too serious, perhaps. Never laughed, never played. A touch of the artistic temperament, if you know what I mean. Purbright did know. In small towns, artistic temperament was code for any behavior marginally outside the narrow comfort of the speaker. He thanked them and continued through the room, gathering fragments of recollection. He found that Clive, in the hour before the luncheon, had been seen moving briskly about the church corridor. He had been seen carrying a folded piece of paper. He had been observed, with equal certainty, carrying nothing at all. Someone claimed he had been angry. Someone else claimed he had been singing happily. A third insisted he had been crying. All agreed, however, that he had been alone. By the time Purbright and Love stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, the inspector had formed no conclusion more definite than this. Whatever had happened in the vestry was not simply a matter of gravity. They began a slow walk toward the police car. The bells of St. Swithin's gave a half-hearted toll, as if embarrassed to draw attention to the day's events. "Something troubles you, sir?" Love asked, hands deep in his pockets. Purbright looked back at the church. "A lad lies in hospital, Love. Possibly worse. Yet there is something about the arrangement of that scene which does not speak of boys' mischief. No sign of anyone else, though. None that declares itself. But consider, Love. Statues, especially those that have stood for centuries, do not simply grow bored and fall." Love pondered. Unless someone pushed it. Purbright smiled faintly. A thought that must cross all our minds. But Clive was small, the statue was heavy. The custard was. Well, I shall reserve judgment on the custard. They walked a few more steps in silence. "Sir," Love said, "you don't think Clive might have been—" "No," Purbright said gently. "I do not. Whatever the lad's nature, whatever troubles or enthusiasms he possessed, the scene lacks the hallmarks of a child's accident." Love exhaled, relieved. "Right, sir," Purbright added. "We must ask ourselves who else might have wished to be near that vestry before the luncheon, and why any such person might not wish to be remembered for it. That'll be a long list." "Indeed." His tone suggested this was not an inconvenience, but a certainty of human nature. They reached the car. Purbright opened the door, paused, and looked back at the church once more, its ancient stones, its quiet modesty, its recently rebellious saint. "There is something in that church that does not wish to be seen," he said mildly. Love shivered despite himself. "What do we do now, sir?" Purbright settled into the driver's seat. "We listen," he said. "Rumor travels faster than truth, but often runs alongside it. By morning, someone will have remembered something." He started the engine, guiding the car away from St. Swithin's as the last parishioners drifted homeward, already reworking the afternoon's calamity into increasingly embroidered shapes. In living rooms and kitchen nooks across Flaxborough, the tale of the fallen saint began its inevitable transformation of uncertain facts stiffening into confident recollection, suspicions ripening into certainty. And somewhere in that quietly shifting landscape of gossip, Purbright sensed lay the faint outline of a motive that was, in its own discreet way, every bit as unsteady as the plinth beneath St. Hildebert. Inspector Purbright returned to the station with the deliberate tread of a man who preferred to let his thoughts settle into place, rather than force them prematurely into order. The late afternoon had grown chillier. Autumn's breath scraped lightly across the pavements as he and Sergeant Love stepped inside the modest warmth of the police building. The familiar creak of the front desk chair and the faint hum of the kettle lent a domesticity that was almost jarring after the cold shadows of St. Swithin's. Mrs. Teal from the front office looked up with that blend of curiosity and restraint she considered professionally appropriate. "Afternoon, Inspector. Word round town is that a boy's been flattened by a saint." Purbright paused in the act of hanging his coat, giving her a mild look. I see the facts have already begun their transformation. Well, she sniffed, I passed along only what I heard. I don't invent anything. Of course not, Purbright said pleasantly. And yet somehow the story acquires details faster than a parish raffle acquires second-hand cardigans. He moved through to his office with Love following, notebook in hand. The sergeant, having achieved his daily quota of restrained silence, cleared his throat. Sir, do you reckon Mrs. Teal's version will be the mildest of the lot? I would count on it, Purbright said, settling behind his desk. By evening, we shall no doubt hear that St. Hildebert jumped. Love blinked, half amused, half troubled. Reckon anyone'll believe that? Belief, Love, is a generous and accommodating thing, especially when exercised by those who have already chosen their villain. Love nodded, though without full comprehension, and pulled out the notes he had taken in the vestry. Sir, what do you make of all those different accounts about Clive before the luncheon? Singing, crying, nothing in his hands, then something in his hands. It tells us something important, Purbright said gently, though perhaps not about Clive. Love looked puzzled. It tells us that people remember precisely what they need to remember to fit the version they prefer, Purbright continued, and what they need to remember is, very often, whatever flatters their sense of perception. Love scratched his head. So is it all wrong? Oh, not entirely. Some scrap of truth may lie buried among the embellishments and inventions. But we must look for consistency in behavior, not in claims. Consistency in motive, not recollection. The sergeant nodded with renewed enthusiasm. Right, sir. So what's our next move? For now, I'd like to speak with Dr. Ferris. He examined Clive when the ambulance brought him in. Why not go straight to the hospital? Because Dr. Ferris has a mind that wanders when confronted with wards and nurses. In his surgery, he is less easily distracted. Love thought about this and decided it best to accept it as one of the inspector's quietly unfathomable principles. A brisk walk brought them past the co-op, the library, and a woman Purbright vaguely recognized as someone who had once complained that the police should arrest her neighbor for improper placement of garden gnomes. By the time they reached Dr. Ferris's surgery, the inspector felt sufficiently reacquainted with the eccentric comforts of Flaxborough to face the next stage of his inquiries. Dr. Ferris, a tall, mild-eyed man who had the air of having woken up slightly surprised every day for the past 15 years, welcomed them with his habitual expression of gentle confusion. Inspector, Sergeant, do come in. I've just finished with 3 cases of indigestion and one gentleman convinced he's allergic to sunlight. Is he? Love asked, genuinely curious. Only on weekdays, Ferris replied with a sigh. Now then, this unfortunate choir boy. You'll want to know whether he'll come round. Purbright inclined his head. If you would be so kind. Ah. Well. Ferris folded his hands, contemplating them as though hoping they might provide the answer themselves. The boy suffered a blow to the head, as one would expect when visited unexpectedly by a falling saint. His pulse was weak at first, but he responded to treatment. He's still unconscious, but the state doesn't seem terminally inclined. That is encouraging, Purbright said softly. And the nature of the injury? Is it consistent with a statue falling naturally from a plinth? Possibly, Ferris said, though without conviction. But if you want my honest impression, Inspector, there was a sharpness to the angle that feels off, as though the statue didn't just topple, but was directed. Love frowned. Directed? Like pushed? Ferris hesitated, reluctant to commit to the mechanics of violence, perhaps nudged, encouraged, assisted by unfriendly forces. Hard to be certain. And Clive's condition? Purbright prompted. Oh, he'll likely wake within a day or 2. Children bounce. Indeed. Purbright rose, thanking the doctor. If he wakes, please inform us at once. Back outside, Love exhaled deeply. So someone might have pushed the saint. Possibly, Purbright said, but let us not settle too quickly on the mechanics. A push tells us little without a reason. It's the reason that interests me. Love brightened. Motives was something he could grasp more firmly than trajectories of medieval statuary. You reckon the boy had enemies? Most of us have enemies, Love, Purbright said with gentle gravity. Only some are kind enough to reveal themselves. They walked back toward the station as daylight thinned into the grayer tones of early evening. Flaxborough's shop windows glowed faintly, their displays offering knitted scarves, tins of biscuits, and the kind of local pamphlets no one bought except relatives visiting from Birmingham. As they passed the church again, Purbright paused. The doors were shut, but a soft light glowed from within. I think, he said, that we should take another look inside. Something bothers me. But the vicar, Purbright said politely, will understand. They approached the side entrance and Purbright knocked gently. After several minutes, a harried curate opened the door, blinking as though the outside world was a rude interruption. Inspector, I thought you'd left for the day. So did I, Purbright said. But questions have a habit of lingering. Might we step in for a moment? The curate nodded and led them inside. The church felt different at this hour, still and dim, its carved angels and saints presiding with disinterested patience. Purbright's steps carried him not to the vestry, but toward a narrow storage alcove tucked behind the organ pipes. Love, puzzled, stayed close behind. Purbright stood for a long moment, examining the floor, the faint tracks of dust, the position of the storage crates. Then he reached down and gently shifted one of the crates aside. Something thin and crumpled lay beneath it. A folded piece of paper. Sir, Love breathed, that the paper people said Clive might have been holding? Possibly. Purbright unfolded it carefully. The pencil marks were faint but legible lines of shaky, uneven handwriting. Please meet me in the vestry before the luncheon. It's important. Don't tell anyone. Signed only with an initial. M, sir, Love whispered. Who's M? That, Purbright said, refolding the paper with quiet precision, is what we must discover. He glanced around the dim, echoing church, noticing once more the unnatural disruption in the dust. Something moved hurriedly, something put aside carelessly, something left in haste. And once we find M, Love, he added softly, we might finally understand what business a 12-year-old boy had with a centuries-old saint, and why someone wished him to be found beneath it. He slipped the note carefully into his pocket. The church seemed to hold its breath. Outside, a cold gust swept across the square as they stepped into the night, their shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Sir, Love asked as they walked toward the station, what do we do now? Purbright's eyes reflected the faint light of the lamp-posts, thoughtful, patient, quietly sharp. We find whoever wrote that note, Love, and we ask why. And then, Purbright said, we shall see what else in this town is waiting to fall. The night had settled thickly over Flaxborough by the time Inspector Purbright returned to the station, the faint lamplight along the high street trembling in the breeze like a row of elderly parishioners trying to stay upright in a draughty pew. Inside, the building felt unusually hushed, as though the very walls had paused to listen for the next development in the curious misadventure of Clive Purley and the fallen saint. Purbright removed his hat and set it on the desk with habitual care. Sergeant Love, who had accompanied him from the church with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, hovered near the filing cabinet. Sir, Love ventured, that note, who do you think wrote it? Could be anyone with an M, couldn't it? Mary Carter, Martin from the choir, Mrs. Mallow, even the milkman. Indeed, Purbright said mildly. The alphabet is inconveniently democratic. However, not every M in Flaxborough had cause to summon a choirboy to the vestry. Love's brow furrowed as he attempted to sort the respectable M's from the suspicious ones. But what reason would anyone have? I mean, he's just a lad. Purbright regarded him with gentle patience. A lad, yes. But even lads may wander into the paths of adults preoccupied with matters they would rather not see broadly discussed. The sergeant shifted uneasily, as though fearing he had stepped close to something too subtle for his usual categories. You think Clive knew something? I think, Purbright replied, opening the drawer for a notepad, that someone believed he did or feared he might. Love's eyes widened. And that's why they arranged for the saint to fall on him? Purbright lifted a hand. Let us not decide upon the mechanics until we know the intention. The intention often explains the method. He sat, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. Tell me, Love, did anything about the luncheon strike you as unusual? You mean besides the saint flattening a choir boy? Yes, aside from that. Love frowned. Well, Mrs. Reeton only had 2 helpings of trifle. That's unusual. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Insightful, but perhaps not yet relevant. No, I'm thinking of the people who were not where one might expect them to be. Who wasn't there? That, Purbright said, is what we must determine. It was nearly half an hour later, after reviewing the vicar's list of luncheon attendees, that Mrs. Teal reappeared at the office door with the triumphant air of someone bearing news of epic significance. Inspector, telephone call for you, from Mrs. Penchlow. Purbright nodded, rising with the patient acceptance of a man long accustomed to receiving late evening calls from citizens convinced they had cracked a case. He lifted the receiver. Purbright speaking. Mrs. Penchlow's voice fluttered down the line like a moth determined to reach a lamp. Inspector. I remembered something. Something terribly important. I thought I should tell you at once. I appreciate that, Mrs. Penchlow. What is it you recalled? Well, you see, I was setting out the cutlery for the luncheon properly. Mind you, none of this modern nonsense with forks on the wrong side, and I happened to glance out through the vestry window. Just a small glance, hardly more than a blink. Perfectly understandable, Purbright murmured. And I saw. Well, Miss Gwendolen Carter. Purbright hesitated. The assistant organist. She was in the vestry. No, that's just it. She was outside it, near the side path. And she was. Talking to someone. Someone. A man, Mrs. Penchlow said with the relish of one delivering an accusation without knowing precisely whom it accused. Tallish, I think. Wearing a coat. I couldn't see his face. But it seemed quiet. Private. I see, Purbright said. And then this is the strange part. Miss Carter went into the church from the side door, but the man didn't follow. He walked the other way toward the alley behind the churchyard. It was all very well, very furtive. Thank you, Mrs. Penchlow, Purbright said warmly. You've been most helpful. Oh, Inspector, she breathed, I do hope this sheds light on things. It may well do. When he replaced the receiver, Love was watching him with a kind of eager dread. Sir, do you think Miss Carter wrote the note? It would be premature to declare it, Purbright said, but it would be equally foolish to ignore the possibility. They found Miss Carter at her small terraced house on Gorse Lane, where she lived alone with a clutter of sheet music and 4 portraits of former organists who stared down from the walls with expressions ranging from benevolent approval to stern disapproval. She answered the door at once, as though expecting them. Inspector, she said, her voice tight. Sergeant, please come in. Her hands trembled slightly as she led them into the sitting room. Purbright observed the signs of agitation with the same quiet sympathy he extended to startled farm animals. Miss Carter, he began gently, might I ask whether you were near the vestry before the luncheon? She pressed her lips together. I was. Yes, I stepped out for a breath of air. That is entirely reasonable, Purbright said. And were you alone? No, her voice faltered. I suppose someone must have seen it. Mrs. Penchlow saw you speaking with a man. Miss Carter winced. Of course she did. Who was he? Purbright asked softly. She sank into a chair, clutching a cushion like a life belt. It was Martin. Martin Thatch. He plays the organ on alternating Sundays. Martin, Purbright repeated. And what was the nature of your conversation? Her cheeks flushed. Inspector, please, this mustn't be misconstrued. Martin and I, well, we have had disagreements regarding hymn selection. He favors modern pieces. I prefer the traditional repertoire. Our conversation was about the program for next month. That is all. Purbright nodded. A perfectly ordinary disagreement. Yes, she insisted. Truly. And did either of you see Clive during that time? No, Miss Carter said firmly. I didn't see the boy until I found him under the statue. Purbright studied her for a moment with the relaxed attentiveness of a man who could hear the tiny pulse of truth beneath a body of anxieties. There was worry in her, certainly, but not the desperate, defensive sort that comes from guilt. More the fretful self-consciousness of someone who fears gossip more than wrongdoing. Thank you, Miss Carter, he said at last. You have been very helpful. When they stepped back into the night, Love exhaled. Doesn't sound like she wrote the note. No, Purbright said thoughtfully. It does not. Then who's M? Purbright looked down the length of Gorse Lane where the houses hunched quietly in their rows, warm little pockets of ordinary life concealing the disordered patterns beneath. That, Purbright said, is becoming clearer. He did not elaborate, for Purbright seldom did until matters had arranged themselves decisively in his mind. Instead, he turned toward the square, where the dim outline of St. Swithin's loomed like a patient witness awaiting further questions. Sir, Love asked cautiously. Someone, Purbright said softly, had reason to draw Clive into that vestry, someone who feared what he might say, or might have already said, and someone whose initial, if written carelessly, might resemble an M. Love blinked. You think it's not an M at all? Purbright smiled faintly. I think, he said, that the shape of a letter depends very much on the haste with which it is written. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, the night air crisp but invigorating, the town quietly shifting in its sleep. Come, Love, he said. There is one more person we must speak with before the night is out. Who's that, sir? Purbright's eyes held a quiet glimmer of certainty. The person who most dislikes being noticed, and who, I suspect, was seen by no one at all. The walk from Gorse Lane back toward the square unfolded beneath a sky that had darkened to a moody violet, the last threads of daylight caught behind the rooftops like something reluctant to leave. Purbright moved with a steady, unhurried purpose, the sort of calm stride that always made Sergeant Love nervous, for it meant the inspector was no longer collecting clues but arranging them. They reached the old lich gate where the churchyard began, its timbers creaking as though whispering some ancient warning to late callers. Beyond it, St. Swithin's bulk loomed in watchful silence, the shape of its tower etched faintly against the deepening night. Love swallowed. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, who exactly are we looking for? Purbright paused beneath the gate's shadow and turned to son, him. Expression thoughtful rather than secretive. Someone who was at the luncheon but conspicuously absent when the saint fell, he said. Someone who had the freedom to move about the church unnoticed. Someone whose initial could easily be mistaken for an M when written hastily, particularly if the writer habitually scrawls with a flourish. Flourish? Love echoed. Purbright nodded. A habit common among church wardens, sextons, and those who keep parish records. The sergeant blinked. You don't mean? But before Love could finish, A figure emerged from the far side of the church, moving with the stiff gait of someone accustomed to slipping through shadows unobserved. The lantern in his hand cast an uneven glow over his narrow face, catching the anxious pinch of his mouth. Mr. Ledden, the parish clerk. He froze when he saw the two policemen. "Inspector," he stammered. "I was just locking up." Purbright approached slowly, kindly, as though addressing a spooked animal. "Ah, Mr. Ledden, just the gentleman we hoped to find." Ledden's fingers tightened around the lantern's handle. Have you discovered something?" "Several things," Purbright said. "Though I suppose it's more accurate to say that certain inconsistencies have resolved themselves." Love stood a little straighter, preparing for whatever confession or collapse might follow, but Ledden only swallowed hard and cast his eyes downward, shoes scuffing the gravel. Purbright allowed the silence a moment to settle. Then with gentle precision, he continued. Clive Purley was summoned to the vestry by a note that ended with a single initial. You'll recall what appeared to be an M, yet the curl at the end was more reminiscent of a careless L, such as one used by someone who signs dozens of receipts, rosters, and parish sheets each week. Ledden's head snapped up. Fear flashed unmistakably. Purbright went on, voice steady. You were not seen at the luncheon during the half hour before the incident, nor were you seen helping prepare the tables, though you claimed you had. Instead, I suspect you were inside the church specifically, near the vestry. I wasn't, Ledden, but the words faltered. Mr. Ledden, Purbright said gently, the truth, even now, may yet preserve some measure of dignity. For a moment, Ledden looked as though he might flee. Instead, his shoulders sagged. He set the lantern down on a low stone and pressed his trembling hands together. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, he whispered. I didn't mean for the lad to be hurt truly, Inspector. I didn't, Love murmured. Sir? But Purbright raised a mild hand, keeping his focus on the shaken clerk. Tell me what you intended, Purbright said softly. Ledden took a shuddering breath. Clive, the boy, he overheard something. A conversation between me and Mr. Dalloway. The vicar, Love blurted, startled. Ledden nodded miserably. He and I had been discussing it. Discrepancy, a harmless one. A matter of funds moved temporarily. From the parish account. Only a few pounds. I intended to restore it after the harvest feast. But Clive, he'd been in the organ loft, cleaning the hymn sheets, and he heard us arguing. I didn't realize until later. And you feared he might speak, Purbright said. Ledden nodded slowly. He was a good boy, Inspector. Honest. Far too honest, I thought. I thought if I talked to him privately, I could explain, reassure him, and persuade him not to mention the matter. The vicar didn't know. He mustn't know. So you wrote the note, Purbright said. Yes, Ledden breathed. I wrote, come to the vestry at once, L. But I wrote in haste. I suppose it may have looked like an M. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. When I went to the vestry earlier to prepare for the luncheon, I noticed the statue was loose. Not dangerously so. I thought only that its base wobbled. I meant to wedge a cloth under it. Then someone called me from the hall and I left. When I returned later, I found it had tipped over. I never imagined Clive would be beneath it. Purbright watched him steadily, his gaze neither accusatory nor indulgent. You expect me to believe, he said gently, that the statue simply fell of its own accord. Ledden looked up, eyes shiny with a desperate sincerity. Yes, Inspector, I swear it. I didn't kill that boy. I would never harm him. Love frowned. But how could it just fall like that? Purbright answered quietly. Because the statue had been unstable for weeks. The mason who installed it warned the vestry committee that the pedestal was improperly leveled. The committee, in its infinite thrift, decided it could wait. Love blinked. "You found that out already, sir. I asked the mason myself this afternoon." He turned back to Ledden. "But Mr. Ledden's guilt, though not of murder, remains. He summoned Clive to the vestry under false pretenses, intending to manipulate the boy into silence. His negligence regarding the statue's instability compounded the tragedy." Ledden bowed his head. "I'll accept whatever punishment is due. I never meant for any harm to come." Purbright sighed softly, hands slipping into his coat pockets. No one ever means for tragedy to come, but intention alone seldom absolves consequence. He signaled to Love, who stepped forward hesitantly but firmly. Ledden did not resist as the sergeant placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Mr. Ledden," Purbright said with quiet finality, "you will accompany us to the station. You will be charged with reckless endangerment resulting in death and with the misappropriation of parish funds." Ledden nodded weakly. "I understand." Purbright lifted the lantern and extinguished its flame before leading the way from the churchyard. The three of them walked in a solemn procession beneath the whispering trees, the air crisp with nightfall and the weight of an honest tragedy rather than a malicious one. As they neared the gate, Love glanced uncertainly at the inspector. "Sir, I suppose this means there was no murderer after all." Purbright's gaze lingered on the church tower, just visible in the dim starlight. "No premeditated murderer, Love," he said. "Only a man frightened of consequences, whose cowardice and carelessness wove together into one fatal moment." Love let out a long sigh. "Flaxborough's full of complicated people, isn't it?" "All places are," Purbright replied gently. "But the complicated are as deserving of understanding as the simple. Justice requires the whole truth of them." They continued in silence toward the station, the quiet night carrying only the rustle of leaves and the distant chime of the church's old clock marking the hour. Inside the dim-lit street, Flaxborough slept on unaware, yet faintly expectant, as though acknowledging that even in tragedy, mysteries unraveled with patience and humanity had a way of restoring the delicate equilibrium of its peculiar little world. Purbright walked steadily, his thoughts already shifting not to triumph, but to the sober clarity that accompanied every solved case. The balance had been restored. Answers, though unhappy, had been found. And somewhere within the town, life was already arranging itself to continue in its gentle, improbable rhythm. For now, that was enough. Morning broke with a pale, apologetic sun struggling through a gauze of mist, as though the weather itself had taken on the town's uneasy hush. Flaxborough rarely managed true silence. Even at its most subdued, there was always a faint undercurrent of clatter, chatter, or municipal fuss. Yet on this particular morning, the atmosphere hung curiously still, as if the town were holding its breath in anticipation of what might surface next. In the station's modest interview room, Mr. Ledden sat hunched in one of the straight-backed chairs, looking very much as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His spectacles lay folded on the table before him, a gesture of defeated surrender. He stared at them as though hoping they might offer forgiveness. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, closing the door with the gentlest of clicks. He placed a small tray on the table. Tea, 2 biscuits, nothing more, and took the chair opposite without ceremony. "I thought," Purbright said calmly, "you might manage a little refreshment." Ledden's gaze fluttered up, gratitude and dread muddled together. "Thank you, Inspector, though I doubt I deserve such consideration." "Most of us deserve quite a bit more kindness than we imagine," Purbright replied, pouring the tea with steady hands, "and a little more scrutiny than we care to admit." He slid a cup toward the man. "Drink." Ledden obeyed, fingers trembling against the porcelain. "Have you spoken to the vicar?" "I have," Purbright said mildly. He seemed rather shocked to learn of the missing funds, but insists his concern is primarily for the boy's family. He asked that you not be treated harshly. Ledden blinked, surprised. He said that? Reverend Dalloway feels? Your actions, though misguided, sprang from fear rather than malice. Purbright gave a small, wry smile. He also, I believe, feels somewhat guilty for his temper during the original exchange. He regrets raising his voice in the vestry. Ledden closed his eyes. I never meant for anything to unravel the way it has. I believe you, Purbright said. But it is important that we understand the full truth. For the coroner's inquiry, for the parish council, and for the boy's family. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sergeant Love poked his head inside, looking torn between apology and urgency. Sir, Love said quietly. Mrs. Purley is here. She's insisting well, strongly requesting to speak with you. Purbright nodded. Send her to my office. I'll join her shortly. When Love withdrew, Ledden looked anxiously at the inspector. Clive's mother. She must think the worst of me. Mrs. Purley thinks the worst of circumstances, Purbright corrected gently. Not necessarily the worst of people. He rose, but lingered a moment, studying the man with thoughtful sympathy. Mr. Ledden, you made grave errors. But errors, however serious, are not the same as murder. It is important that you remember that distinction. He took a step toward the door. I will return after I've spoken with her. As Purbright made his way down the corridor, he felt the familiar weight of human frailty, its quiet, pervasive ache. Justice was never as clean as people wished it to be. Often it involved untangling the mess made by fear, avoidance, pride, and small, foolish decisions that snowballed into tragedy. And when the guilty party was not a villain but an anxious, brittle little man, the work became all the more delicate. He found Mrs. Purley seated stiffly in his office, a handkerchief crushed between her fingers. Though her eyes were red, her posture retained a determined dignity, as though grief alone were not enough to unseat her sense of propriety. Mrs. Purley, Purbright greeted gently, taking the seat across from her. I understand you wish to speak with me. She inhaled sharply. Inspector, I must know what really happened. People are already talking. I hear whispers about negligence, others imply something darker. I need the truth before rumor poisons what little peace I can cling to. Purbright folded his hands on the desk. I will tell you plainly what we have learned. Your son was summoned to the vestry by Mr. Ledden, who intended to speak with him privately about a sensitive matter. Ledden feared the boy might inadvertently bring trouble upon him and hoped to dissuade him. Mrs. Purley tightened her grip on the handkerchief. And the statue? The statue had been unstable for some time, Purbright explained. The pedestal was improperly leveled, an issue that had been raised repeatedly but not addressed. When the boy leaned against the table to inspect something on the shelf, the vibration was enough to tip the statue. She shuddered. So all this, everything, was it an accident? My Clive wasn't murdered. Purbright hesitated only long enough to ensure the truth would land without cruelty. Yes, Mrs. Purley, a tragic accident made worse by poor judgment, but not murder. She bowed her head, tears spilling anew. He was a good boy, too curious for his own safety, perhaps. But good. He was, Purbright said softly, and he deserved better from those entrusted with the church's welfare. Her shoulders shook once, but when she lifted her head again, there was a quiet steadiness in her expression. What will happen to Mr. Ledden? He will face charges, Purbright replied gently. But I do not believe the court will lack compassion when the full circumstances are known. Mrs. Purley closed her eyes in weary acceptance. I thank you, Inspector, for your honesty and your patience. When she left the station, Purbright remained seated for a few moments, staring thoughtfully at the worn grain of his desk. Grief, he reflected, often sought simple villains where none existed, The truth in this case, though painful, might offer some measure of peace, or at least prevent the town from spinning darker tales woven from ignorance. A soft knock drew him from his thoughts. Love entered again, scratching his head in that endearingly confused manner Purbright had grown accustomed to. "Sir," Love said, "something else has come up." "It's a bit odd." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Odd in what way?" "Well, sir, Mr. Dalloway's just arrived. He says there's been some new development in the vestry ledger, something he thinks you ought to see." Purbright blinked once, slowly. "New development. Ledger. Oh dear," he murmured. "I was afraid of that." He rose from his chair, smoothing his jacket with unhurried precision. "Come along, Love. It seems our understanding of the situation may not be as complete as we assumed." Love's eyes widened with alarm. "You don't mean there's more to this after all?" Purbright allowed himself the faintest sigh. "There is always more, Sergeant. If life were content with simple endings, we would all sleep much better." They stepped out into the corridor, the air tinged with a peculiar mixture of dust, warm radiator pipes, and the faint aroma of Mrs. Hicks's midday mutton pies drifting from the break room. As they approached the lobby, the vicar appeared pale, distressed, and clutching a heavy, leather-bound ledger to his chest, as though afraid it might flee under its own power. "Inspector," he said breathlessly, "thank goodness, you must come at once. I fear the boy's death. It may not have been the accident we believed." Love's mouth dropped open. Purbright did not react so dramatically. He merely tilted his head with calm interest, the gears of his mind shifting with cautious precision. "Very well," he said quietly. "Show me." And together, they stepped into the deeper shadows of Flaxborough's tangled truth. The short walk from the police station to St. Swithin's should have been easy. It was familiar, ground, utterly harmless, even soothing in its way. Yet as Inspector Purbright moved along the cobbles at the vicar's brisk, fretful pace, he felt the unmistakable shift of a case refusing to behave. It was like a stubborn drawer. One could shut it, but it would never sit flush. Sergeant Love followed a step behind, casting anxious glances at the ledger clutched to Reverend Dalloway's chest. "Sir," he whispered, "I thought this was all sorted." Purbright kept his eyes on the church, its stonework glowing faintly with the last tint of afternoon. "It was sorted," he replied mildly. "At least within the boundaries we understood. But when new information arrives—" Love finished glumly. "We unsort it, sir." "Precisely." Dalloway pushed open the vestry door with unnecessary drama, his fingers trembling slightly as though he feared the building might swallow him whole. Inside, the air held its usual mixture of candle soot, lavender oil, and the faint, lingering scent of brass polish. The dust motes swirled as if eager for a new scandal. "Please," the vicar said, placing the ledger down on the vestry table. "Look at this page. I found it this morning when reconciling the offerings." Purbright stepped forward. The ledger lay open at an entry dated 2 weeks prior. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, just a list of contributions and expenditures, everything neatly recorded in Leaden's tidy, looping hand. But halfway down the page, between the offertory total and the altar guild's expenses, lay a single line obviously added later in a thicker, jerkier script. "Repairs to South Transept 42 Sur approved." Purbright's eyes narrowed. Curious. Love leaned over his shoulder. £42, sir. That's a fair sum. Was that the money Mr. Leaden moved?" Dalloway shook his head frantically. "No, that amount was never withdrawn, and what's more, there were no repairs made to the transept. None at all." Purbright tapped the entry lightly. This handwriting, certainly not Leaden's. "Exactly," the vicar said. "Someone altered the ledger. Someone who wished to justify removing that money later." Love frowned. But if Leaden didn't take it, who did? Purbright turned another page. The next sheet bore Leaden's handwriting throughout, until the last line at the bottom. Again, that thicker script. Funds to be transferred by the clerk. Purbright's expression softened into a look Love had seen many times, quiet interest seasoned with the faintest trace of disappointment. "Sir?" Love asked uncertainly. "What are you thinking?" "That Mr. Leaden's misappropriation," Purbright said gently, "may not have originated with Mr. Leaden." Dalloway shuddered. "Inspector, are you suggesting he was coerced?" "Coerced or persuaded," Purbright replied. "In matters involving church committees, the difference is often merely social pressure dressed up as piety." Love scratched his cheek. "But who pressured him, sir?" Purbright directed his gaze across the vestry to the oak notice board, where various sheets fluttered softly under the window's draught. One in particular caught his eye. "Parish Improvements Fund. Chairwoman, Mrs. Mildred Copping." Ah! He could almost hear her voice already. The lofty tone, the firmly arched eyebrows, the unwavering conviction that she alone carried the moral weight of Flaxborough's spiritual upkeep. "Love," Purbright said, "did you by any chance see Mrs. Copping at the luncheon the day of the accident?" Love blinked. "Yes, sir. She was at the table with Mrs. Sabin Smith discussing the merits of daffodil varieties. They were having quite a lively argument." "And did Mrs. Copping remains there?" Love frowned, thinking. "Well, now that you mention it, sir, she did disappear for a bit. Said she had to check on something in the parish office." Dalloway shifted uneasily. "She's very zealous about financial oversight, sometimes excessively so." Purbright closed the ledger with a soft thump. "Let us pay her a polite visit." Mrs. Mildred Copping inhabited a tidy house just off the high street, prominently flanked by two ornamental rose bushes she insisted were of ecclesiastical significance, though no one could get her to explain how. The curtains were lace, the windows spotless, and the door-knocker polished to near blinding brightness. She opened the door before Purbright had fully raised his hand to knock. "Inspector," she said with a stiff little bow, "I've been expecting you." Love blurted, startled, "You have?" Mrs. Copping's mouth tightened in a prim smile. "Well, someone in this town must anticipate matters with competence. Please, come in." The sitting room was aggressively orderly chairs arranged like poker players, each with an embroidered doily draped at a perfect right angle. On the hearth lay a basket of hymnals, arranged by size. A clock ticked sternly on the mantelpiece, as though keeping moral time. Purbright sat with his customary gentleness, as if mindful that the furniture possessed memories. "Mrs. Copping," he began pleasantly, "we've discovered adjustments in the vestry ledger, alterations not made by Mr. Leaden." Her eyebrows arched, two sharp tufts of disapproval. "Ah, you have found it then." The poor man was never equal to the task. Purbright tilted his head slightly. "You acknowledge making the entries?" "Of course," she said as though it were obvious. "I chair the Improvements Fund. It is only natural that I authorize expenses relating to parish maintenance." Purbright regarded her quietly. "Even those which never occurred?" Her lips pressed together. "Inspector, one must sometimes anticipate work before it is formally completed. If we had waited for the mason to finish the transept repairs, we should have been waiting until Advent. And he is a man who charges by the hour." "But no repairs were done," Purbright reminded her gently. "Not yet," she corrected sharply. Love blinked. "But the money wasn't that removed after you wrote the line?" She hesitated. "Just long. Enough. I withdrew a portion, yes," she admitted. "But only temporarily. It was needed urgently for the choir robes." Purbright's gaze remained steady. The choir had new robes last year. Mrs. Copping's color rose. "Newness fades, Inspector. They needed it. Brightening." Purbright let a soft pause settle. Not accusatory, just patient. When Mr. Ledden discovered the discrepancy, he said softly, "He panicked. He believed the vicar would blame him and that you would deny any involvement." Mrs. Copping stiffened. Well, naturally, I should have denied it. A committee chairwoman cannot be mired in clerical minutiae. And so, Purbright continued, Ledden arranged to speak privately with Clive Purley after overhearing the boy mention a missing amount. A boy who, I suspect, was more observant than you anticipated. Mrs. Copping's breath shivered, and when the statue fell, Purbright said quietly, "You encouraged the notion of Ledden's guilt, not because you wished him imprisoned, but because it protected you." Silence stretched across the room like a drawn curtain. "He would never have borne the blame alone," Mrs. Copping whispered. "He was a grown man, a church officer. Why should a boy's idle curiosity carry such weight?" Purbright's voice softened even further. "Because that boy trusted the church, and the church failed him." Her composure faltered then, just slightly, enough for a small, trembling sigh to slip free. "I never meant harm. I only meant order." Purbright stood. Not briskly, never briskly. "Mrs. Copping, you will come with us. You will give a full statement, and perhaps in time the town may understand what happened here. But for now, we must finish this with honesty." Her eyes closed. She nodded once. Love stepped forward, not unkindly. The sun had dropped behind the rooftops by the time they stepped back into the street, Mrs. Copping walking between the two officers with surprising quietness. The evening light smudged the cobble's gold, softening even Flaxborough's more stubborn angles. Love exhaled slowly. "Sir, do you think the town will believe her?" Purbright folded his hands behind his back. "In time. And if they do not, they will at least accept the truth, which in Flaxborough is often the nearest thing one gets to justice." They walked toward the station, the evening bells sending gentle echoes through the town. The air felt a little lighter now, though not yet clear. There remained the necessary explanations, the formal statements, the coroner's findings still to come. But the shape of the truth had been revealed, and that was always enough for Purbright to continue calmly into the next hour. Behind them, the church tower kept silent watch over a town that would gossip, mourn, bristle, and eventually settle, just as it always had. Flaxborough, after all, was nothing if not resilient in the face of peculiar truth. The moment Purbright stepped back into the station, the hum of midday activity felt strangely distant, as though the town itself were holding its breath. The ledger, now resting in an evidence envelope on his desk, seemed to radiate its own quiet tension, a reminder that everything he had uncovered so far was only the scaffolding of a deeper structure. Mortimer's earlier confession about the coded entries had guided Purbright closer, but there was still a missing element, something that should have slotted naturally into place and hadn't yet revealed itself. He loosened his collar, sat, and began leafing through the copies they'd made of the book's most suspicious pages. Most of the coded transactions repeated patterns, pairs of numbers linked with brief abbreviations, each corresponding to farm deliveries, seasonal harvests, or equipment rentals. But a few of these three clusters, to be exact, broke the pattern entirely. They were similar, yet deliberately altered, as though someone had tried to mimic the ledger's language without truly understanding its rhythm. Purbright tapped his pen lightly against the page, then again, the tempo shifting as recognition dawned. Each irregular entry coincided with a date or location that someone else, entirely outside the agricultural sphere, had recently visited. Eleanor Hurst. That realization felt less like a revelation and more like a confirmation of a suspicion he had been circling for days. Eleanor, the archivist who claimed to have stumbled upon the ledger by accident, had been present at nearly every turning point of the investigation, helpful but uncomfortably well-informed. She had insisted she had no prior knowledge of the farm's affairs, yet her spontaneous comments had often anticipated details he had not yet disclosed. He rose from his chair, the thought pressing harder. Perhaps she had been attempting to steer him gently and subtly toward conclusions that aligned with her own agenda. Before he could voice the idea, W.P.C. Teal appeared, breathless, holding a sealed envelope. "Sir, this arrived just now, delivered by hand. No name on the outside, but the clerk says the woman who dropped it off insisted it was urgent." Purbright accepted it, eyebrows knitting. The envelope was a nondescript cream, slightly creased, bearing only a single initial on the back. E. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. He opened it carefully, half expecting another coded message, but the handwriting was steady and precise. "Inspector Purbright, you will find what you're missing at the lock house near the viaduct. You must come alone. The truth has been twisted long enough, and I will no longer be part of it." E. No threats, no elaboration, just a location and a promise. Purbright studied the signature for a long moment. If Eleanor had written it, she was either prepared to confess or to manipulate him further. Either way, the lock house seemed unavoidable. He left Teal in charge of monitoring incoming calls and set off across the narrow road that led toward the viaduct. The autumn sun was lowering, but still bright, casting long gold lines along the trees. As he walked, he rehearsed the possible scenarios. Eleanor waiting in distress, Eleanor cornered, or Eleanor arranging for someone else to confront him. None of them required backup if handled correctly, but each demanded alertness. The lock house emerged from behind the last bend, a small brick structure, old but well-maintained, perched beside the sloping embankment. One of the windows was half open, curtains fluttering faintly. Purbright approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The door was ajar. He nudged it open and called her name. Eleanor stood not far inside, her posture tense but not frightened. She held the same calm expression she had worn throughout the investigation, though now it seemed stretched, as though held together with careful effort. "I wasn't sure you'd come alone," she said quietly. "But I hoped you would." "That depends," he replied, "on what exactly you intend to tell me." She motioned toward a small wooden table beside her. On it rested a thin stack of documents, bound by twine. "Everything you've been searching for," she said. "Copies I shouldn't have kept, but couldn't bring myself to destroy." Purbright stepped closer, but remained just out of reach. "These relate to the irregular entries in the ledger, I presume." Her exhale trembled. "I altered them. Not all, only the ones that pointed to transactions benefiting someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near them. I thought if I made the pattern less obvious, it would buy us time." "Us?" His voice remained steady, but the word carried weight. She nodded. "Me, and the one who pressured me into it. He said no one would ever check, that I was only smoothing a few harmless details to keep the Agricultural Board from investigating further." She swallowed. "But I should never have agreed. I made myself part of everything that followed." Purbright studied her face, reading the flickers of guilt, fear, and justification. Who was he? She hesitated too long. Before she could answer, a heavy thud echoed from outside the lock house, something dragging across gravel. Purbright pivoted instantly, stepping between Eleanor and the doorway. "Is someone else here?" She shook her head. "I didn't tell him I was sending you a message." "I swear." Another sound interrupted her creak, low and metallic. Purbright edged toward the door and glimpsed, through the narrow gap, a figure moving along the embankment. The silhouette was unmistakably familiar, broad-shouldered, deliberate in posture, and too composed for someone simply passing through. Purbright's mind aligned the shape with a name before he fully registered it. Mortimer. Except this Mortimer did not look like the nervous, bureaucratic clerk he had interrogated earlier. This Mortimer moved with purpose, scanning the area, his jaw set like a man who had no intention of leaving loose ends behind. Purbright stepped fully outside, closing the door behind him just enough to shield Eleanor. "Mr. Mortimer," he called out evenly, hands clasped behind his back. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Mortimer stiffened, then offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Inspector, fancy meeting you in such an out-of-the-way spot. I could say I was just out for a walk, but I suspect you wouldn't believe me." "That depends," Purbright replied calmly. "Are you armed?" "Not visibly," Mortimer said with a shrug, though the edge in his tone betrayed him. "I suppose you've spoken with Eleanor. She's always been too sentimental for her own good." Purbright sensed Eleanor listening from just behind the door. Mortimer's gaze drifted toward the lock house, and he took a step forward, voice dropping. "You shouldn't have involved her, Inspector. She doesn't understand how delicate these matters are." "Delicate?" Purbright replied. "Forging ledger entries? Concealing illegal land transfers? Or intimidating an archivist into aiding you?" Mortimer's expression tightened, and for a moment, something raw flickered behind his composure. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Those entries were never meant to be exposed. The people funding these acquisitions have deeper pockets than you can imagine and no hesitation when it comes to preserving their investments." Purbright angled himself subtly, one foot shifting into a defensive stance. "Is that a threat?" "More of a courtesy," Mortimer murmured. A crack of movement sounded behind Mortimer branches, shifting under sudden weight. Mortimer spun, startled, and that instant of distraction was enough. Purbright lunged, grabbing his arm and pinning it back with practiced force. Mortimer fought harder than expected, nearly breaking free before Purbright hooked his leg and drove him to the ground. Gravel scattered, and a sharp cry filled the air as Mortimer's resistance faltered. Purbright held him steady, breath controlled. "This ends now." From the lockhouse doorway, Eleanor emerged, hands trembling but relief softening her features. "Is it over?" she whispered. "For now," Purbright replied, hauling Mortimer upright. "But I suspect this is only the surface. Whoever Mortimer works for won't appreciate losing their intermediary." Mortimer spat weakly, frustration rather than malice. "You have no idea how long this has been building. Stopping now won't change anything." Purbright steadied his grip, eyes cool. "We'll see." He guided Mortimer down the embankment toward the narrow footpath leading back to the road. Eleanor walked beside him, carrying the packet of documents pressed tightly to her chest. Purbright cast a brief, thoughtful look her way. She had made serious mistakes, but her choice to come forward now was the turning point the investigation needed. Ahead, the winding road shimmered under the fading sun, carrying them toward the next stage, the deeper layer, the truth waiting just beyond the horizon. Now generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style. The slow trudge back toward the village road carried a tension that neither Purbright nor Eleanor attempted to break. Mortimer, pinioned between the inspector's grip and the pull of gravity along the uneven slope, had ceased struggling but had not softened. He moved like a man cataloguing his options, even in defeat. Purbright sensed the calculations turning behind the man's steady, narrowed gaze. Although the clerk was outwardly under control, there remained the unmistakable aura of someone who believed the game was not over, merely paused. As they reached the crest of the path and the first houses of Flaxborough reappeared, the late afternoon sun dipped behind the chimneys, its fading warmth casting long shadows that stretched across the cobblestone. Purbright felt the subtle shift inside himself, an inner tightening that always accompanied the final convergence of clues. The revelations ahead would not simply expose Mortimer's deceit, they would unravel the larger pattern that had eluded him until now. Still, he opted for silence, allowing Mortimer's mind to stew in anticipation. Eleanor walked several steps behind, clutching the bundle of documents to her chest. Her anxiety showed not in her pace, but in the precise way she held the papers, like a fragile object that, if dropped, might shatter the last chance she had to right her wrongs. Purbright slowed slightly, allowing her to draw closer as they approached the station. Inside, WPC Teal straightened instantly. "Inspector, should I prepare an interrogation room?" "That won't be necessary just yet," Purbright replied. "Place Mr. Mortimer in holding. See that he has water and a moment to gather himself." He glanced at Mortimer, whose jaw clenched at the notion of kindness he did not expect. "We'll speak shortly." Teal led Mortimer away, leaving Purbright and Eleanor alone in the dim corridor. With practiced gentleness, he motioned for her to follow him into his office. The small space, with its shelves of case files and half-washed teacups, felt almost comforting in contrast to the tension hanging between them. "Sit down," he said, closing the door quietly behind him. "Before we go any further, I need you to tell me everything clearly and without omission." Eleanor's first breath trembled, but her posture straightened. "I will." She unraveled the twine and spread the documents across his desk. Purbright leaned forward, scanning the meticulously arranged pages. The earliest sheets were correspondence between the Agricultural Allocation Board and a private investment consortium, one whose name he recognized only in passing: Loxwell Holdings, a shell company with no clear headquarters, known to shift assets between counties under the guise of development incentives. "They approached me almost a year ago," Eleanor began. "At first, it seemed harmless. They claimed the old farmland hadn't been assessed properly and that the board needed updated records. But when I requested their official authorization, they sent Mortimer instead. He said he'd act as liaison." She swallowed hard. "He pressured me, subtly at first, made it seem as if refusing would threaten my position. I believed him." Purbright scanned another sheet, a ledger excerpt that had been altered twice. Once cleanly and once clumsily, the latter clearly Mortimer's doing. Attached was a map showing overlapping boundaries of several farms, each with disputed inheritance claims or owners too old or detached to monitor the fine print. This wasn't just about property consolidation, Purbright murmured. They were creating a continuous parcel of land for resale, possibly for industrial development. Eleanor nodded. "That's what I came to understand. But by then, I'd already altered enough files that walking away felt impossible." "And the intimidation?" Purbright asked quietly. She hesitated. "Mortimer said he was protecting me. But when I refused to alter the final set of entries, he became insistent. He said the people behind this wouldn't forgive hesitation, that if I exposed anything I'd be considered complicit." Purbright studied her expression for any trace of deceit. What he saw instead was exhaustion and a deep, gnawing regret. "You've taken a risk by stepping forward now," he said finally. "But it's not too late to make it right. These documents will help connect Mortimer's actions to the organization he's been shielding." Eleanor let out a slow, relieved breath. "I feared you might not believe me." "I rarely deal in belief," Purbright replied gently. "But I do deal in patterns, and yours fits closely with one I've been tracking for days." He stood, gathering the documents in order and sliding them into an evidence folder. "Come with me. But remain silent during the questioning unless I ask you to speak." Mortimer, when Purbright entered the holding room, was seated with his arms crossed, posture relaxed but eyes sharp with resentment. If he felt cornered, he concealed it expertly. "Mr. Mortimer," Purbright began, placing the folder on the table, "we need to clarify your involvement in the manipulation of agricultural property records." Mortimer smirked. I imagine Eleanor has painted a very dramatic picture. She presented documents, Purbright corrected. Not a picture. And what do you suppose they prove? Mortimer leaned back. That I assisted her, that I advised her. Administrative discretion isn't a crime. Purbright opened the folder, sliding one sheet forward. This is your handwriting. The alterations are inconsistent with Eleanor's style. They implicate you directly. Mortimer's composure wavered momentarily, but he recovered. A mistake, perhaps. A correction. Then explain, Purbright said, folding his hands. Explain why you were near the lockhouse. Today, explain why you've been present at nearly every site along the disputed properties long before any official reassessment began. Mortimer's silence was more telling than an answer. His jaw tightened, his foot tapping once, twice. Then his gaze flickered toward Eleanor, as though measuring how much she had confessed. You both misunderstand, he said finally, voice low. I wasn't working for them. I was working to protect this town. Purbright raised an eyebrow. Protect it? By forging records to allow unregulated land acquisition. Mortimer leaned forward, voice sharpening. Loxwell Holdings isn't planning industrial development. They're planning consolidation for sale overseas. You think this village struggles now? Wait until half its land is owned by foreign buyers who don't know or care what happens here. I've spent years watching bureaucrats mismanage Flaxborough. This was a chance to steer it, to keep the estate intact long enough for local buyers to intervene. It was an explanation layered with conviction, yet frayed at the edges, something like desperation threaded through righteous intent. So, Purbright said slowly, your solution was to overwrite legal boundaries, intimidate an archivist, and hope no one noticed until your plan succeeded. That is hardly the noble crusade you paint it to be. Mortimer's expression hardened. Sometimes the line between protection and deception is thin. And you crossed it, Purbright replied, standing. Repeatedly. He motioned to Teal, who had been waiting outside. Formal charges will be prepared. As Mortimer was led away, Purbright felt the final pieces sliding into place. Mortimer had not been a simple villain, rather a man who, believing himself a guardian of the town's future, had allowed the ends to justify increasingly dangerous means. Eleanor remained at the threshold, watching, her face pale but resolute. Purbright turned to her. Your testimony will be essential, but more importantly, your honesty now means the investigation can be brought to its proper conclusion. She nodded, relief and sorrow intermingled. Thank you, Inspector. Purbright offered a faint, reassuring smile. Outside, the evening light grew dimmer, but the path ahead had finally cleared, no longer twisting, no longer obscured. The ledger, once a whispering enigma, had spoken its truth. Now generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. The wind had sharpened by the time twilight crept across Flaxborough, casting the village in that peculiar half-light which renders familiar rooftops strangely distant and the church spire slightly more judgmental than usual. Inspector Purbright paused on the station steps before re-entering the evening bustle inside. The cases he handled seldom reached tidy resolution in a single sweep. Rather, they revealed their secrets with the reluctant slowness of an old ledger being prized open, page by stubborn page. Today's developments had brought the investigation within arm's reach of clarity, yet it remained incomplete, still missing that final thread that would stitch every loose end into place. Inside the station, Love stood at the reception counter, discussing something earnestly with WPC Teal. The moment he saw Purbright, Love stiffened, adjusting his tie as though bracing for examination. "Sir Mrs. Kettleford is here again," he said, tone both apologetic and beleaguered. "She insists she's remembered something crucial. Something about the choir boy." Purbright suppressed a sigh. Mrs. Kettleford's recollections were notorious for arriving in batches, some useful, some wildly inaccurate, and most embellished with the sort of embroidery that grows thicker with each retelling. She was harmless, but her timing was a curious thing, rarely accidental. "Very well," Purbright said. "Let's see what fresh illumination she wishes to offer." They found her perched on one of the station's wooden benches, clutching her large floral handbag like a life raft. She rose instantly, bustling toward Purbright with the solemnity of one bearing national secrets. "Inspector, I couldn't rest another minute," she declared. "Not after what I heard at the greengrocer's." "That must have been quite an afternoon," Purbright replied gently. "Would you like to sit?" No, this must be said at once." She leaned in, lowering her voice dramatically. "I overheard Mrs. Vennick remarked that the boy, poor Clive, had been seen near the church vestry the day before his accident, and she said he was carrying a parcel. A small one, wrapped in brown paper." Purbright's gaze sharpened, though he kept his expression mild. "A parcel? Are you certain Mrs. Vennick said it was the day before, not the morning of the accident?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Kettleford replied proudly. "I asked her twice." "Indeed." Purbright paused thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Kettleford. You've been most helpful." When she had taken her leave, satisfied that justice had been advanced by her timely intervention, Purbright turned to Love. "Sergeant, the parcel is new." Love frowned. Could it be related to the documents Mortimer was trying to hide? "Unlikely," Purbright mused. Mortimer's concerns centered on land records and administrative control. Clive would have had no reason to carry anything of that nature. Yet he brought something into the vestry. A day early. "If it weren't part of the property business," Love said slowly. "What was it?" "That," Purbright replied, "is precisely what we shall find out." As they walked down the corridor, Purbright found his steps slowing, his gaze drifting toward the frosted window beside the interrogation rooms. Mortimer sat within, head bowed, elbows on the table, a man who believed his version of righteousness outweighed legality. Yet despite Mortimer's considerable involvement, Purbright could not quite connect him to this new, peculiar detail. What would a choir boy carry in a parcel to the vestry the day before his death? The answer, when it brushed the edge of Purbright's mind, was so simple it almost startled him. "Love," he said abruptly, "fetch Reverend Dalloway and the church's verger, Mr. Blee. Have them join us in the vestry immediately." The church loomed in the growing dark, its stone exterior absorbing the fading light until it resembled a mute observer to the village's troubles. When Purbright, Love, Reverend Dalloway, and the stooped, anxious Mr. Blee entered the shadowed nave, the air smelled strongly of candle wax and the faintest trace of incense, though the vicar assured them he'd not lit any since the funeral. "This way," Mr. Blee said, shuffling toward the vestry. "Though I'm not sure what more there is to see, Inspector. We've been over every inch." "You have," Purbright agreed. "But I have not, at least not with this particular detail in mind." Inside the vestry, the familiar assortment of hymnals, robes, candlesticks, and the battered oak table awaited inspection. Purbright moved with deliberate slowness, surveying the shelves and cupboards with renewed attention. Then his gaze settled on a stack of old wooden offering boxes. "Mr. Blee," he said quietly, "were any of these locked recently, or repaired?" Blee scratched his nose, puzzled. "Repaired, yes, one of them. Wobbly hinge. I fixed it last week." "Which one?" "That one there. Second from the bottom." Purbright knelt, pulling the box into the center of the room. It appeared perfectly ordinary. Plain wood, brass latch, faint smell of polish. But when he lifted it, the weight was wrong, too heavy for an empty offering box. Dalloway frowned. "I thought they were all emptied before the festival." "They were," Mr. Blee insisted. "Everyone." "Except," Purbright murmured. "This one was not empty." He opened the box carefully. Inside lay rolls of coins wrapped in brown paper, the exact sort a child might carry without arousing suspicion. Alongside them was a sealed envelope. Purbright picked it up. His eyes narrowed. To Mr. Ledden. "Private." The vicar blanched. Good heavens. "Inspector, do you think the boy intended to—" "Yes," Purbright said softly. Clive Purley wasn't visiting the vestry to expose Mr. Ledden. He was delivering something he had found, something he believed belonged to him. "And the money?" Love asked, bewildered. "Look at the dates on those paper sleeves," Purbright said. Love did then gasp. "These are from last year's Christmas charity drive." The vicar sagged against the wall. Ledden. He must have hidden the surplus while preparing the accounts, and the poor lad must have stumbled across it while fetching candles or hymn sheets. Purbright nodded. Clive tried to return the money privately. Perhaps he was frightened. Perhaps he hoped to avoid trouble. But Mr. Ledden, already panicked about his finances and terrified of being exposed, summoned him again the next day to explain. And then, the accident. A terrible, tragic accident, the vicar whispered, but in its way, unavoidable. Purbright closed the offering box with a soft click. What tipped the balance wasn't malice. It was fear. Ledden's fear of disgrace. The boy's fear of confrontation. Fears merging in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mr. Blee cleared his throat anxiously. Then, Mortimer had nothing to do with the lad's death. "Nothing directly," Purbright said. His actions triggered the larger investigation, and he intimidated Miss Cartwright, but he did not cause the statue to fall. "And the envelope?" Love asked. Purbright opened it gently. Inside was a short note written in a child's careful hand. "I think this belongs to the church money. I found it when I was putting away the candles. I didn't tell Mum. Please don't cross." Clive. A heavy stillness filled the vestry. The truth, Purbright reflected, was rarely dramatic. But it was always human. "Sergeant," he said softly, "we shall return to the station. There are statements to finalize." They emerged into the quiet evening, the church settling behind them like an exhausted witness relieved to have finally spoken its part. The wind had softened, not warm, but no longer harsh. A transitional breeze, one that suggested tomorrow might bring a steadier light. Love walked beside him, thoughtful. "Sir, do you think the town will ever hear the whole story?" "Eventually," Purbright said. "Truth has a way of finding its audience. But it is not always necessary that everyone knows every detail. What matters is that justice, in its gentlest form, is done." "And the vicar?" "He will grieve," Purbright murmured. "For the boy, for Ledden, for himself. But in time he will understand that the church suffers not from the sins of those who stumble, but from silence about them." Love nodded, though he looked far from comforted. The station lights glimmered ahead, a small beacon through the gathering dusk. Purbright took a deep breath, steadying himself for the final stretch of the inquiry. Everything now fit perfectly into place. Every whisper, every ledger entry, every tremor of fear that had traveled through the town, and soon he would put it all into words. Words quiet, measured, and inescapably true. The following morning, Flaxborough stirred to its usual rhythm, the butcher arranging cuts with meticulous care, the bakery sending forth clouds of yeast and sugar into the chilled air, and the council clerk scurrying to replace yesterday's misplaced papers. Yet, beneath this facade of ordinary activity, the quiet shock waves of recent revelations lingered, unseen but palpable. Purbright arrived at the station with a folder tucked neatly under his arm, containing the final pieces of the case, each annotated, cross-referenced, and verified. Today, the loose ends would be gathered together, the whispered truths of the ledger laid bare, in a single, civil, and inescapable account. Inside the interrogation room, Mortimer sat stiffly at the far end of the table, handcuffs removed but wrists marked faintly by the previous restraint. He looked up as Purbright entered, eyes calculating. There was an air of residual defiance, though tempered by the undeniable reality that his machinations were now fully exposed. "Mr. Mortimer," Purbright began in his characteristic even tone, "I have compiled the chronology of events from the earliest alteration in the ledger to your interventions in various parish and land affairs." He slid the folder across the table. "I suggest you follow along." Mortimer flipped through the pages quickly, his lips tightening. Purbright noted the small flickers of emotion, surprise, then irritation, then the cautious realization of exposure. "You see," Purbright continued, "the ledger entries you attempted to manipulate, the threats and pressure you placed upon Miss Cartwright, the care with which you concealed certain documents, all of it fits into a coherent pattern. Your pattern. One that, fortunately, left a few inadvertent traces." He tapped the folder lightly. "Even the most meticulous measures cannot fully suppress human habit, Mr. Mortimer." Mortimer exhaled sharply, then leaned back. "You have all the evidence," he said. "Do you intend to prosecute?" Purbright's expression remained serene. "That is a matter for the authorities. But first, I believe the town deserves clarity. It deserves to understand the motivations, the mistakes, and the consequences. It is often far more instructive than mere punishment." At that moment, the vicar arrived, accompanied by Mr. Blee and Eleanor Hurst, who carried her bundle of documents still neatly tied. All took seats as Purbright outlined the entire course of events. Leaden's panicked misappropriation of church funds, Clive Purley's accidental discovery and subsequent attempt to return the money, the minor but consequential role of Mrs. Copping in misdirecting suspicion, and finally, Mortimer's overarching interference intended to manipulate land ownership under the guise of town protection. Dalloway's hands were clasped tightly, his eyes misty but attentive. "So, was the boy's death not intentional?" he asked softly. "Not directly," Purbright confirmed. "It was the unfortunate intersection of fear, misunderstanding, and circumstance. The boy acted with honesty, Leaden with anxiety, and Mortimer with overzealous prudence. Each action, human in its nature, compounded the others." Eleanor exhaled, relief washing over her face. I feared I had made everything worse," she admitted. But knowing the full story. "Your honesty now," Purbright said, "has allowed the truth to emerge. Without it, the investigation would have remained obscured, and the ledger would have continued to whisper its secrets to no one." Love, standing near the door, gave a small, approving nod. "A fine resolution, sir," he said, though even he could not disguise the somber weight in his tone. "Though tragic, at least the pattern is understood." Purbright allowed a brief smile, a softness of expression reserved for moments like this. "Patterns," he murmured, "often reflect human nature more than criminal design. In Flaxborough, it is rarely malice that causes tragedy, but rather fear, pride, and a misplaced sense of duty." The vicar rose, adjusting his vestments. "I shall see that the parish communicates this to the congregation with care. The boy deserves remembrance not for the accident, but for his integrity." "And Mr. Leaden?" Eleanor asked. "He will be required to account for his part," Purbright said, but tempered with the understanding that panic, not deceit, was the root of his error. Accountability need not equal condemnation. Mortimer, finally standing, met Purbright's calm gaze. You've assembled quite the narrative, Inspector. I suppose I will answer for my actions." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed. But remember, truth, even when inconvenient, has a peculiar way of restoring order, even in a town as quietly complex as this one." The group rose together, the case having reached a serene, inevitable conclusion. They walked out of the station, the day brightening with the soft clarity of understanding. Flaxborough itself seemed to breathe more easily, its shadows receding slightly, the church spire now a silent witness to the restored equilibrium. In the days that followed, the town absorbed the story in its usual manner. Gossip weaving through the high street, half-truths embroidered into teasings at the bakery, and cautious nods at the post office. Yet the essential facts remained intact. Clive's honesty, Leaden's panic, Mortimer's misguided intentions, and the ledger's whispering secrets, all reconciled into a coherent civil account. Mrs. Copping returned to her committee with a gentler, more cautious approach. Eleanor resumed her archival duties with renewed prudence, and the church funds were finally audited and reconciled without further incident. Purbright returned to his office, quietly filing the ledger and all associated correspondence into the long-term case archives. The clock ticked evenly, the soft hum of the station a reassuring presence. There was no grand celebration, no public fanfare. Justice in Flaxborough was subtle, polite, and precise. It arrived not with dramatic gestures, but with careful observation, a calm explanation, and the patient alignment of facts and human nature. As he sipped his tea and marked the final notes, Purbright allowed himself a brief, private reflection. In a town where gossip was faster than truth, where pride often obscured reason, and where the ordinary concealed its own quiet dramas, the most extraordinary events were those that reminded everyone how fragile and human their daily lives remained. And yet, in that fragility, the truth retained its steady, unassuming power. The ledger lay closed on his desk, a quiet monument to clarity, and Purbright returned to his paperwork, the village beyond continuing its gentle, resilient rhythm, content in its ordinary peculiarities. Flaxborough had survived another small, peculiar storm, and life, as always, would go on.